We're only in the first month of 2026, and there's no surprise today. These geopolitical games are getting more and more complicated. Not only we're seeing how Donald Trump it's intentionally, or we call it unintentionally, changing the global order. But also, on the other hand, people are also concerned about the role of the US at this moment. And for example, this ongoing political and also this economic competition between US and China. And what about over the weekend and this negotiation between the US government and the nation of Iran? Putting everything together, how do we understand the role such as Donald Trump? Is it just because he's an unconventional leader, or he's intentionally changing the global games? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Seva Gunitsky. Again, Professor Gunitsky is the George Ignatieff Chair of Peace and Conflict Study at the University of Toronto. Well, Professor Gunitsky, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, again, Professor, it's such an honor to have you on our show as well. As I mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing article you wrote, which is entitled The Personalist Global Order, When Individual Wins Strive, Great Power Policy. Well, Professor, I want to get started. It's rather fascinating that you describe the sitting US President Donald Trump as a personalist leader. And your definition is one that concentrates power around himself and also his inner circle. So, Professor, from your perspective, why do you think that Donald Trump is a personalist leader? And how do we understand his strategies or also the policies, especially when he deals with like nation of Iran or China and etc.? Your thoughts?
Well, it's a great question because we don't tend to think of the U.S. as having a personalist regime, which is a very specific type of a system where, as you said, power is concentrated not in a ruling party, not in some kind of military junta, but in a single individual. And the key is not just that this individual shapes foreign policy, but hollows out the formal institutions around them. So if you think back to like Brezhnev's Soviet Union or post-Mao China, even those regimes, even though they're closed autocracies, they typically allowed some collective deliberation among the elites. So there were some mechanisms for advisors to push back, for some information flows, for decisions to be debated, basically, behind closed doors. And personalist leaders reject all that. And we've seen the rejection of formal institutions with Trump. These kinds of regimes, they select advisors based on loyalty. They live in these enclosed informational bubbles that filter out bad news. And essentially, they guide policy through their own private grievances or private fixations, rather than like the national interest or anything resembling a deliberative process. And Trump is kind of unusual because he, unlike Xi or Putin, he operates in a system that still has legal constraints. He still has genuine opposition and some loud critics. But the reason I would call him personalist is that he's basically systematically bypassing all these institutional checks that would normally you see disciplining presidential decision making. So pushing out career officials, surrounding himself with cronies that are selected for loyalty, not for competence, people like Steve Witkoff or Pete Hegseth. These people don't have traditional foreign policy expertise, but he knows them and they tell him what he wants to hear. So in these kinds of regimes, the normal channels for professional advice are replaced by sycophants. And, compared to his first term, there's no longer anybody in Trump's inner circle who is able or has the resolve to contradict him. So you get decisions that are driven by personal fixations, such as, in Venezuela or in Greenland, rather than any systematic assessment of national interest. And that's a huge change in U.S. foreign policy.
Well, Professor, let's keep the conversation going. In the article, you specifically mentioned that Donald Trump's answer towards international order or towards law and order. And this is what he said, and I quote, he said, "My own morality, my own mind, because the only thing that can stop me is I don't need international law," end quote. So, Professor, from your perspective, again, we know that how much Donald Trump or people like Donald Trump cares about the poll number or the popularity ratings. But at this moment, he says that the only thing can stop me is his own morality, his own mind, and he doesn't care about international law. How concerning is the statement like that? Because we're seeing, again, as you mentioned before, his desire for Greenland, and he tried to end the war in Ukraine, and also he tried to cater up to the Chinese leader. So putting everything together, how concerning and how anxious should we be as an international community?
Well, I don't think I have to tell the international community to be concerned. You know, they already are, and the reason is clear. Like if you have no space between your personal whims and your national policies, then you introduce an element of volatility and unpredictability into U.S. foreign policy that is already causing a lot of tensions in the NATO alliance, et cetera, et cetera. Because if foreign policy is not guided by institutions, but by personal whims, then you're much more likely to see policies that don't seem to make much sense, like his pursuit of Greenland, that he was very concerned about it, and then he stopped, right? Because these policies just shift on a dime, on personal whims. It could also mean that crises could become more likely to escalate, because essentially these leaders discard anybody who tells them they're wrong. So there's nobody to help them correct the errors in their policies. So we've already seen some evidence of that in Trump's first year, and I imagine it will only intensify. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned public opinion. That's something we would think should constrain Trump. And to some extent it does, especially on domestic policy. We see him occasionally walk back certain things that some of his underlings said. But in general, at least when it comes to foreign policy, he does not seem to be too concerned about public opinion. As you quoted him, he basically sees his own morality as the only guide to foreign policy, not international law, certainly not U.S. Norms or U.S. institutions. And that's a concern not just for U.S. allies, who've been sort of bearing the brunt of his whims and grievances, but also for the U.S. itself, because it undermines U.S. standing in the world, and basically leads to a kind of a policy of hegemonic suicide, essentially, where the U.S. retreats from global leadership and becomes an unreliable partner. That affects not just the world, but it affects America's standing itself, too.
Professor, but I do want to ask again, it's rather fascinating to listen to you how we can understand the personality, or we understand this mentality of Donald Trump. But in the article, you also mention another word. It's called personalism. And you use Russia as example. You say as Russia has fallen even deeper into personalism, and so it has southern neighbor China. But let's talk about the definition of personalism, because some argue that country such as the U.S. today, it's slowly and quietly walking towards authoritarianism. So, Professor, from your perspective, number one, what is the definition of personalism? And number two, what are the differences between authoritarianism and personalism? Which one is more concerning? Your thoughts?
Well, there's no good choice there, I'm afraid. It's they both come with their own problems. But as you've already alluded to, personalist regimes are different in the sense that there's a single individual, and the regime essentially becomes an extension of one person's psyche, right? Again, like you look at classic autocracies, like post-Mao China or the most of the life of the USSR, there is still some collective deliberation among the elites, right? So Khrushchev was pushed out by that collective. right? So there are mechanisms for advisors to deliberate and to push back. With a personalist regime, all of that is discarded, all of that is eliminated. Everything basically comes down to what the person at the top wants. And we can add other leaders that are personalist in nature, perhaps Erdogan in Turkey or Modi in India, where basically all formal institutions get pushed aside and it's all about the leader and their inner circle. So in that sense, it's different from things like even Latin American military juntas, right? Where there was a group or a collective of certainly autocratic leaders, but they at least deliberated, right? There's no such thing in the personalist regime. It's almost kind of neo-feudal in that everything is centered around the sovereign and their wishes and their desires. And that's not a good way to conduct modern foreign policy. It leads to all kinds of strange foreign policies, as we've seen, strange obsessions. We see this in Russia, for example, with the invasion of Ukraine, which was an extension of Putin's personal grievances in many ways. And we see that increasingly, I think, in China with Xi purging the military. He basically wants people who are supremely loyal to him, no matter what, and that can turn into a kind of paranoia over time. One thing that, when we study personalist regimes over time, we see that as leaders become entrenched, they get increasingly more distant from reality, they get more over-optimistic, and basically they start making bad choices, and there's nobody there to correct them. So it's not even that there are personalist regimes in power right now, but it's the interaction of these personalist regimes. That is Russia and China and the US all are exhibiting these pathologies. And when personalists interact, that can lead to some really problematic outcomes.
Professor, it's again, when we talk about the regimes or when we talk about the authoritarianism, there's no doubt that China is the best example. But I do want to go back to the article you mentioned and you wrote, under Xi Jinping, China has become an increasingly tight controlled system. And Xi has, for example, abolished term limits and fired internal critics. We know that today when we see China, not only the international community is rather anxious about this economic growth, but also about this military ambition under Xi Jinping. And what about, again, I keep on going back to the question is, and what about the alliances? Again, China, it's well known for not interrupting any international affairs. And China has been very outspoken about, for example, the war in Ukraine and also the chaos in the Middle East. But meanwhile, how do we understand someone like Xi Jinping, someone like Donald Trump, in terms of what we called alliances? How do you think that the games are playing at this moment? They have to care about, again, the international community, but meanwhile, they seem to change the games all the time. Why is this so complicated?
Yeah, so in a personalist regime, alliances become much more fragile because, again, it's not about the institutions that link up alliances or bureaucratic inertia or anything like that. It's about leaders interacting. So for Trump, for example, alliances don't really seem to matter that much. He sees traditional U.S. allies as kind of at best useful sidekicks and at worst kind of freeloaders who refuse to recognize their status as subordinate to the U.S. It kind of like he has kind of a billionaire's idea of allies where they're more like hired help. They're not strategic partners. So there's no trust. There's no shared purpose. It's temporary arrangements, right? Maintained at the pleasure of the powerful. So if an ally fails to align with Trump's priorities, the U.S. is ready to walk away. And in that world, in the world of personalist regimes, institutions don't matter as much, or at least not current liberal institutions. And again, if you look at Trump, he clearly sees institutions like the UN or the World Health Organization not as tools of American influence, which is how American presidents have traditionally treated them, but as institutions that are rigged against the U.S., as obstacles to American sovereignty. And so as a result, what you get in the personal system is the choices of these leaders, whether it's Trump or Xi or Putin, they're shaped by individual incentives. They're not by national concerns. So they care about the things that they're fixated on, whether it's oil or territory or personal enrichment, instead of what makes their countries more prosperous and more secure. And we saw that with Greenland, for example, right? There's zero reason for the U.S. to pursue the possession of Greenland. It's totally counterproductive to U.S. interests. So it has already endangered the NATO alliance. And by the way, there are already existing treaties that allow allow the U.S. to set up naval bases there. But when Trump was asked about it, I think in that same interview you mentioned earlier, he said something like, "Well, ownership is what I feel is psychologically needed for success." So in that world, again, there's no distinction between personal impulse and national policy. So we get kind of almost a pre-modern world where peace or diplomacy is maintained through personal bonds of obligation, not formal institutions. So it's almost like palace courts or like tributary arrangements. It's not the liberal order, but it's not classical realism either. It's almost pre-modern in its rejection of sort of Westphalian sovereignty, its demand for tribute and gratitude. I mean, we're constantly seeing Trump and Vance demand that the allies thank them. It's almost like a pre-modern mindset, really. It's a bit bizarre.
Professor Gunitsky, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about another perspective. Again, going back to the article, what about NATO at this moment? Again, when we talk about the issue or the controversy on Greenland from Donald Trump's perspective, I mean, I would say unsurprisingly that he placed heavy tariff on the NATO members, simply because the countries that, or the leaders just don't agree with what he wants at the first place. So at this moment, what role do you think that NATO play at this moment when we are dealing with someone like Donald Trump as a personalist? And do you think that today the NATO members should be more united and also send stronger messages to Donald Trump regard his foreign policy or regard his personal greed? What do you say to that?
Well, yeah, I think Europe definitely needs to step up. It has to some extent. They made it clear, at least some countries made it clear to the U.S. that they would not be tolerating this. And so he seems to have backed off. He sees Europe as essentially a bunch of freeloaders, free riding on U.S. security guarantees. I think he sees NATO as a weakness for the U.S., which is very, very different from how past presidents have seen it. And of course, this is a vision that very much aligns with what Russia wants, right? I watch and I read Russian media, which I don't recommend, but I have to do it professionally once in a while. And they were extremely happy about Greenland. Ultimately he backed off, but the confrontation has been very bad for NATO. And so I think, we could go back to Mark Carney's speech a few weeks ago, where he said, look, it's time to stop pretending that the U.S. is going to come in and rescue us. We should not just abandon the U.S. or pretend it's not going to be a partner anymore, but we should start trying to get our own thing going. As Europe, as middle powers, we should make the world that we want to see, right? Instead of relying on the hegemon who is currently destroying it. And so for Russia, Russia sees this as a good thing, because if Trump is creating this personalist global order where his personal whims are the only thing that matters, and he's withdrawing from Europe and he's withdrawing U.S. support for Ukraine, then that leaves Russia's so-called near abroad open to be taken advantage of. So at least for now, what the Trump's foreign policy is pursuing aligns very much with Russia's vision of the world and Putin's vision of the world. So at least for now, they're happy.
Well, Professor, I do want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, we talk about the character of a personalist. Again, and also we talk about the role of China, U.S., and also the jeopardy they're facing at this moment. We're only in the first month of 2026. Where's the hope? So in other words, how can we understand the world better when we deal with someone like Donald Trump, when we deal with someone who's a personalist? Because again, in the article, you also mentioned about North Korea, many other countries. Especially, we know that today, North Korea is continue to be very concerning to Japan or even to the whole world. So how can we understand the sanity, or how can we find sanity when we look at someone like Donald Trump? Your final thoughts.
That's a rough question. I mean, the big difference is this, right? If you have an institutionalized regime, institutionalized governments, when you make deals with other countries, whether it's North Korea or whoever, those deals depend on bureaucratic machinery, right? You have institutions, you have agreements in place, etc. Personalist arrangements are leader-to-leader productions, right? And they're not institutionalized, and so they're fragile. So you look at Trump's deals with North Korea in his first term, for example, right? There was a big meeting with Kim Jong-un, and pledges to denuclearize in exchange for sanctions relief and all of that. But that didn't go anywhere, right? After the cameras left, the deal was over. So North Korea is still going about its nuclear program, even as Trump proclaimed victory. So any bargains signed between personalist regimes and other states are fragile for that reason. So if you're asking me for a note of hope, I mean, I think the one hope that is possible is that the competition of the global order disciplines states to not behave foolishly, right? I'm still kind of a realist in that regard. I believe that states will be punished if they act in foolish ways. And we are already seeing some of that with the U.S., with allies hedging and with supply chains sort of diversifying. So my hope is that the more personalist foreign policy brings about bad things for the U.S., the more it disciplines American leaders to not behave in that way. But that may be an optimistic hope, given, again, that they're not that concerned about the national interest. They're more concerned about things like personal enrichment or pursuing whatever personal grievances they might have. So in that sense, I'm pretty pessimistic about the future of the global order, at least for the next few years. And even if we get somebody, in 2028, assuming there are elections and they all go well, even if we get a U.S. president who is, say, pro-NATO or anti-Trump in that way, there's been a lot of trust that's been eroded, because you cannot build a relationship on this idea that every 4 years, the most powerful country in the world flips a coin, and you might get a normal person or you might get Caligula. That's not a good way to conduct a long-term foreign policy relationship. So I hope there's a disciplining effect that stems from just making mistakes in the competitive system, but at least in the short term, I'm not too optimistic.
Well, again, Professor, you're not the only one. I know that today when we look at the global order and also the international affairs, and every day there's a surprise, and it's not the surprise that can really make the world better. It's the surprise that really make us to think about and also think through the decisions that we make every day. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Seva Gunitsky. Again, Professor Gunitsky is the George Ignatieff Chair of Peace and Conflict Study at the University of Toronto. Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention to the global affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Will. Thanks so much.